This is a conversation with Dr. Alistair Miller, the Canadian scientist who wrote the paper that inspired the creation of the International Hydrail Conferences. Dr. Miller was an early and deeply informed expert on the menace of extracted carbon fuels to the climate. He is known for his talks on the effects of acidity on shell-forming sea fauna. This is EnergyNews.Biz Hydrail interview series. To support it, please check out our advertising options in the description. Thank you. And now, here's Dr. Alistair Miller. Who is Alistair Miller?
All right. That's a fair question. The answer is long and complicated, and I won't give you the long and complicated version. Maybe the place to start is that I work in the nuclear industry in Canada. I've actually been retired for about 17 years, but I still have an emeritus position. So I've been there for more than 50 years. And my main interest has been in the production of heavy water. But the processes that we've developed in recent years depend on hydrogen water exchange. And so there is a connection to hydrogen. And way back in, I think, 1998, there was a conference in Ottawa that our people were invited to send someone to, discussing climate change. And I was fingered to present at that, and whipped together fairly quickly quite, well, I think one would call it a very high-level paper on where one might apply hydrogen to the climate change issue. I say it was pretty high-level stuff. I ranked a number of options for transportation that would use hydrogen on a number of criteria, and out of that ranking, the top was rail. But to step back just a little bit and to sort of explain where this comes from, you've got obviously the background in climate change and the need to get away from fossil fuels. But where hydrogen fits in is, to my mind, and I think most people would agree with this, not in the sort of mass transportation business, not in cars at the light end, but toward the heavy end of things, where either the duty cycle is more or less 24/7, and where battery charging becomes a serious issue, although that particular issue is gradually getting better. Battery charging is moving along quite neatly. But more importantly, where you have a need for more energy than can reasonably be provided by batteries. And that's where hydrogen fits in my mind. The reason it doesn't extend further, there's two reasons really. One is that it's a relatively different technology from the point of view, at least, of fueling from what people are used to. And so it's not really a terribly attractive area to introduce the general public to, in my mind. Although, obviously, a number of the car manufacturers are actually producing hydrogen-powered vehicles. And California in particular seems to be well along to deploying some of those things. But the most important aspect of it, I think, is that if you're going to go to hydrogen as a fuel, you'd better have good reasons for doing it. Because if you can do it with batteries, the battery cycle is a good deal more efficient than the hydrogen one, assuming you're using electrolysis to make the hydrogen. That's not the way hydrogen's normally made today. Usually they use steam methane reforming, but the electrolysis route, assuming you have reasonably green electricity to put into it, you're probably getting 35–40% overall efficiency when it comes from electrons in to electrons at the actual wheel. So if you can do it by batteries, do it by batteries. But there are many applications where that just does not work. And so that paper looked at where one might reasonably put it. And rail came out on top. Although ships were very close behind, the important thing from the point of view of this story was that that paper happened to get picked up by Stan Thompson. And he was convinced, I guess, by the arguments and really started the push in the States for hydrail as the way to apply hydrogen in the first place. So that's where it started. Stan has always been very generous in acknowledging that paper. And I say it was a sort of rushed off, no great depth to it, very high level indeed. But I still think it stands, actually. And apart from this scattering of cars that are powered by hydrogen, which I think is a bit of a distraction, trains are where it seems to be opening up first. Canadian Pacific have a couple of locomotives that they're trying out. We've got, of course, the German example of their island trains. And the other areas that will, I think, come along are ships, where there's no way you can possibly do that with batteries. The only alternative probably is ammonia, but ammonia really is a version of hydrogen. And it has its, to my mind, disadvantages, but it has attractions too. The long-distance trucking area seems to be gradually coming alive. Buses are already quite big, particularly in China. Ballard has a tremendous amount of experience in fuel cells. And of course, I haven't explained this, it's a complicated business, but fuel cells are the way to do it. You can burn hydrogen in a diesel, but fuel cells have the huge attraction that either slightly more efficient than you can do with the diesel, but more importantly, they're tiny. And that's important because if you're trying to put together power unit and fuel storage, the space that's occupied by a diesel is shrunk down to the size of the fuel cell, and you've got lots of space now to store your hydrogen as a high pressure gas. And in some instances, liquid hydrogen will make sense, but the 700 bar hydrogen compressed gas is the obvious way to go. And I was involved about 3 years ago with quite a detailed study of hydrail applied to the network of rail around Toronto and Ontario. And we demonstrated that indeed you could do just that you could fit within the normal shell of a locomotive, the fuel cell tiny, and all the hydrogen storage that you needed for relatively short distances, up to about 100 kilometers. So it's coming. The prediction was, in fact, apparently reasonably sensible, and it's unfolding the way I hoped it and assumed it would unfold. The only sad part of it is it's taken 25 years for it to really take hold. I've been writing papers about the importance of combining nuclear and wind and solar renewables going back more than that. And that too is beginning to take shape, because hydrogen is the ultimate flywheel from the point of view of storage of electricity when you have an excess of capacity. And so you do it typically between midnight and 6 a.m. Another of the things that we studied in this Toronto area, that if we use the cost of electricity in that period, you could provide all the hydrogen that the system needed. And the competition there was with electrification of the track. And we demonstrated, I think, quite clearly that the cost of going the hydrail route was a tiny fraction of the cost of putting up catenaries. And of course, the disadvantage of the catenaries is that you draw current at times of peak demand, the morning rush hour and the evening rush hour, whereas with the hydrail approach, you make hydrogen when no one else wants the electricity anyway.
So, going back to these conferences, how important were they, these gatherings?
I'm sorry, I didn't.
How important were the hydrail conferences?
Hydrail conferences. Probably others would answer that more authoritatively than I can, but I think they did have considerable visibility. And Stan in particular was, I think, highly to be commended for his persistence in mounting those conferences virtually every year. So yeah, it wasn't a message that the technical world was ready to grasp. And in fact, unfortunately, so far, the work that we did on that Toronto area network hasn't produced the desired results, because basically they were comfortable with the idea of catenaries, even though they had no experience with catenaries, but they said, you know, I've been done in other places. We want to stay with that rather than this exotic hydrail. Okay, so there's some over in Germany. I think things are changing. They haven't actually committed anything yet. And as I said, the Canadian Pacific decision to trial hydrail locomotives, I think maybe a bit of a game changer there. So I still have hopes in that direction, but it hasn't been an easy sell to move away from the conventional diesel electric locomotive to a fuel cell electric locomotive, although it's really not a big shift. People aren't used to it.
In your opinion, who were the most important people and organizations back then on the conferences?
Oh, Stan, undoubtedly. No, Stan was I mean, he had people around him who were supporting him, but Stan's the one that kept on harping away at it.
As I can see, you are tracking pretty closely the happenings in the hydrail these days. And what's your take on it?
I think it is coming quite rapidly now, but not as fast as one would like. You know, 2030 is the sort of almost the drop dead by date, and you know, we'd be lucky if this is really beginning to be widely adopted technology by them, and beginning to be adopted. So again, I wish things had been picked up faster, but now it begins to move. I mean, planes are the ultimate frontier for this. And if I digress a little bit on that score, the attraction there, of course, is in weight, because hydrogen is a bulky fuel. On a volume basis, it's not particularly attractive, but on a weight basis, it's marvelous. About a third of the weight in energy sense of kerosene. And there clearly is work beginning with both Boeing and Airbus to look at hydrogen fueled planes. And there was a very interesting bit of work done about 1990 by Lockheed, where they demonstrated that they could have hydrogen fueled planes, but most importantly, by using liquid hydrogen, which is the obvious thing for planes because the volume is an issue, that they could cool the leading edges with the cold hydrogen as it was being vaporized, and it reduced the drag by about 10%. And you sort of think, well, didn't they ice up the wings as a result? But the answer, of course, is that if you're in the stratosphere, it's dry as a bone. And so that's not an issue. And it has this extra attraction that not only can you use this very light fuel, but you actually get more efficient performance as well, because turbulence is reduced.
So there's another concern when it comes to transporting hydrogen. And what would you recommend in that direction?
That's a complicated question. It depends on what you're trying to transport. I mean, as I've said already, I think in most instances, in hydrail certainly, and in heavy trucks, that sort of thing, buses, compressed gas is the right way to do it. There's a rapidly emerging interest in the production of hydrogen for intercontinental transfer of energy. And Germany is particularly keen on getting its hands on hydrogen from Canada. And for that, the transportation is probably best done as ammonia, because it's relatively easy to ship. And the alternative would be obviously liquid hydrogen, but liquid hydrogen, it takes about a third extra energy to produce and less attractive on that basis. For ships, liquid hydrogen clearly is the right propulsion fuel to my mind, but ammonia is a possible backup. But I say bulk shipping, yeah, send it as ammonia. And that I have hopes will actually start to unfold in a significant way within this decade. Certainly the Germans seem to hope that they can.
There are also certain concerns about the leaking of hydrogen.
Yeah. And this is a relatively new concern, and it's an overblown one, I believe. You're referring, I think, to the potential competition with hydrogen for the hydroxyl radical. Okay. Now, the process is not, I believe, terribly well understood, but hydrogen is destroyed very rapidly in the atmosphere, but most of it actually apparently is destroyed by washout into soils. So it's only about 30% of the hydrogen that is actually competing with methane for the hydroxyl radical. Methane is obviously not terribly well understood, but even if the worst concerns are realized, and it really does have a sort of one-for-one effect, you're not going to leak a lot of hydrogen. It won't bite into the benefits of hydrogen seriously, unless we're absolutely irresponsible in terms of how we contain it. And I think we've seen the example of how escape of methane has been tightened up, at least in the West, and it can be done. We can make the hydrogen handling sufficiently tight that this is not going to be a big issue. There is a secondary issue, a direct one. That's an indirect one. There is a direct one of hydrogen finding its way up into the stratosphere, where it would produce some moisture in the stratosphere itself, which would be a direct greenhouse gas effect, just adding to the water column. But that's pretty minor. So no, I'm not particularly concerned about that. I think it's good that it's been brought up as an issue now, because it can be logically addressed, and it does mean that the hydrogen industry, as it emerges, has to behave and be sensible and not emit very much. I'm sure that can be done.
Heating homes with hydrogen.
Yeah, silly idea. And that brings me on to another one. I'm at odds with the Chalk River nuclear establishment that I work for, or I still consult for. So probably a better description of what I do. And one of the early applications of electrolytic hydrogen is to feed it into natural gas pipelines, where it's subsequently going to be burnt along with the natural gas. And they proudly say that they can contain up to 20% hydrogen in the pipeline without any serious modifications to the metallurgy. That's the concern, that more hydrogen might cause embrittlement. But if you think about it, that's on a volume basis. If you think about it on an energy basis, it's somewhere around 7%. And you're not making a significant dent in the footprint of burning natural gas. Burning hydrogen for heat just doesn't make any sense at all. Start off, I mean, where are you going to actually apply that with any significant impact where you can't get electricity to do the job first off? So you're throwing away almost 2/3 of the energy, and you could do it almost 100% efficiency with just electric heating. Or you can do even better than that with heat pumps. So it's a complete non-starter as far as I'm concerned. And adding it to natural gas pipelines is something that the natural gas people like, but again, makes virtually no sense at all.
What would you say is a perfect energy mix to replace carbon fuels?
That's a good question. Out of the top of my head, I would say probably 2/3 to 3/4 electricity and hydrogen filling in the rest. That would be a pretty good arrangement. I say a lot of the current transport consumption is in vehicles that can be and will be powered by batteries quite satisfactorily. But the bit that can't easily be handled, the other third to a quarter, yeah, hydrogen is the obvious way to go there.
The current developments may indicate that hydrogen will be used also for cars, and there's a big requirement for the infrastructure and so on.
Exactly, which is, to my mind, somewhat unnecessary, but yeah, batteries will do it perfectly well. I don't see why people should complicate the situation by, again, with this relative inefficiency. There may be some situations like taxis, for example, if they're going to be on the road high proportion of the time and refueling is an issue, maybe, but I say refueling is getting so fast that even that I don't see as particularly attractive. So I tend to think, even though there's an early adoption of hydrogen in light vehicles, cars, I don't think there's a big future in that. I think batteries will do fine. And as you say, the network issue is a huge issue for that. Electricity is everywhere, hydrogen isn't.
Now, going to the colors of hydrogen, there are already many contracts signed for blue hydrogen, and of course, we should strive for the green one. How do you see this unfold?
Yeah, blue hydrogen, if you really have a tight system and you can sequester the CO2 in decent available formations, yeah, okay. I like what I call turquoise hydrogen, though. I don't know whether you're familiar with that one, where basically you take natural gas and you get two hydrogen molecules out of it and carbon. And the carbon, people tend to say, can be sold anyway. It's true. But if you did it on the scale that I think might be really significant, you can throw the carbon away. We know that carbon is utterly stable in that form as basically graphite. And we know that because if you look in places like the Amazon rainforest, you'll find soils that have carbon that's been left over from Aboriginal people's cut and move burns that been there for hundreds of years and it's still there. It actually improves soil fertility too. So it is a possible route. And where you haven't got good geology to allow you to use blue hydrogen, then turquoise hydrogen, although you're only getting half the hydrogen out of it, would be a reasonably good route. Again, of course, you have to be reasonably careful in terms of the leakage of methane when you're producing it, but the industry has got a lot better at that than they. Well, when I was first involved with this, they use natural gas pressure to power their instrumentation at the gas wells and just vented. They're just using the pressure. They're not changing at all, just vented the gas out. That sort of thing has stopped. So they're much better at that now. But turquoise, yeah, it's a possibility. And there is a lot of work going on to support turquoise. Pink hydrogen, of course, is just a misnomer if the electricity comes from nuclear in the first place. And I'm a nuclear person and proud of it. It's not really a distinction. It's as green as the best wind and solar.
So getting the hydrogen with nuclear, is that at least part of the solution?
Yes. Oh, yeah. No, I mean, even if you left hydrogen out of the picture altogether, I don't for one moment believe that the world can get sufficiently off fossil fuels without a good chunk of nuclear. And I think that is increasingly being accepted everywhere, perhaps except Germany.
So will we be there on time to stop the climate change with the current deadlines and activities?
That's a loaded question. And the answer is that question can't really be addressed. I mean, if we could somehow turn it all off tomorrow, that would be great, to get ourselves to a point where we start emitting less somewhere within this decade would be probably as much as we can hope for, but it'll be a real struggle. And the impact on climate is already quite obvious. To give you an anecdotal example that comes very close to home for me, we live normally in Canada, in what's called Central Ontario, and in the 50-some years that I've lived there, the normal first frost would have been about 21st of September, give or take a little bit. This year it was well into November before we had a killing frost. Other end used to be that you couldn't plant things in your garden till about May the 24th if they were frost sensitive. Now you can put them in at the beginning of May with very little concern. So clearly the seasons are shifting, and shifting quite consistently, and sea levels are rising. Perhaps most importantly of all, although it's not talked about as much, the oceans are acidifying, and that is having fairly profound effects and could have worse effects still if we let it continue. And for that, the sort of the ultimate solution that's talked about, some of the geoengineering solutions at least, won't do any good. So that there's unless you somehow can go the route of ocean fertilization with iron filings and sequester a lot of carbon that way, that's a potential geoengineering solution. So a lot of people don't seem to like the notion. If you're just going to play with the incoming insolation from the sun, either extraterrestrially, which is one of the wilder schemes, or by seeding the stratosphere with sufficient quantities of sulfate, you're not going to address the other problem, the CO2 acidification problem. And that really is a big one, because so much of the bottom end of the life chain of the oceans is tied up with shelled zooplankton, and they are going to find it increasingly difficult, just as corals already are, to form their structures, because the water has got more acid.
Even if we get there on time.
Well, I mean, it's going to be a question of how hard can we press to get there. We've already changed things substantially. It's a question of how well we can apply the brakes to stop it from becoming even worse. And one of the interesting things that I discovered relatively on, we did quite a bit of sort of second-order climate modeling using surrogates for the big meteorological models. And one of the things that really surprised us at the time was that the effects of changing the CO2 emissions had a 20-year lag. So things that we do today, presumably better things, aren't really going to change the outcomes for about 20 years, which gives you some idea of the desperate nature of the situation we've got into.
So this means that some things that we already done are not reversible, or yes?
All of the things that we've done up till now are not reversible, not easily reversible anyway, and their full impact has yet to appear. And we've really only been increasing the CO2 levels significantly since about 1960, but at increasingly rapid rates in the latter part of the last century. And only now we're sort of beginning to level it off. I mean, ultimately, perhaps they are reversible in the sense of technologies that will take CO2 out of the atmosphere. And some of them are more natural than others. And if you can improve the uptake by increasing forestation, that would be a positive thing. But some of the others are really worrying in the sense that the survival of existing forests and any new forests depend on your containing forest fires. And as temperatures rise, the danger is that you're going to have bigger losses to those. And perhaps worse than that, in the high Arctic regions, particularly in the northern hemisphere, you have vast quantities of peat bogs and methane clathrates, the sort of methane ice that's assisted by the presence of methane. As temperatures rise, those become increasingly unstable and can produce a very nasty feedback effect or an amplification effect on top of what we're doing ourselves. So I'm really quite deeply concerned that we are going to have to face a future that is, even if we're working hard finally to address the issue, it's going to be an uphill struggle, both from the delays in the system and from these secondary forces that will act to amplify what we've already done.
So, talking about the delays and complications, what would you recommend in terms of policies and global cooperation in hydrogen push?
Well, obviously getting off fossil fuels in whatever form we're currently using them as fast as we possibly can. Deploying wind and solar, yes, in ever-increasing quantities, but they have their limitations because they're, depending where you are, they can be quite seasonal, although there's some degree of offset between wind, which tends to be stronger in the winter, and solar, which is stronger in the summer in places like Canada. But there's still sort of nasty shoulder periods when neither of them is working fully effectively. So you need something that would complement those green sources, as they conventionally describe them, and nuclear can do that. I mean, nuclear has high reliability and is available 24/7 and can actually be modulated fairly easily too. And so one of the most hopeful developments is in the so-called small modular reactors, with the emphasis, to my mind, on modular, because that means that they can be deployed relatively quickly, extensively. And the small is all very relative. I mean, they're going up to 300 megawatts electrical. That's not all that small. It's only sort of about 2/3 of the size of the main first generation of CANDU reactors that Ontario still operates in large extent and gives us about 60% of our electricity is nuclear. So that's one of the most hopeful developments that's available to us, that deploying these second generation, or third generation, depends how you count it, nuclear reactors extensively. One of the silly arguments that's advanced against nuclear by the more hair-shirt Greens is that it's a finite resource. Well, it is true it's finite. There's only so much uranium, but there's 4 times as much thorium. The uranium itself could last a million years. So it's not really an issue. We've got enough resource material there that nuclear is effectively an open-sourced supply. And I say not on its own. It has to be blended in with wind and solar, because those can be deployed more easily and more extensively, but they come up against the issue of their variability and unreliability, which is very difficult to address. Batteries, yes, to some degree. Fancy things like compressed air storage, pumped water where you can get away with it, but unfortunately that's not available in too many places. So I think if you don't have nuclear, I think most people would agree, and most people who are reasonably informed and have analyzed the situation, something like 30% of the energy has to come from nuclear sources if we're going to really get off carbon. And of course, one should put some emphasis on getting off the dirtiest carbon first, which is where it's so tragic that the Germans, I'm sorry, I keep complaining about the Germans, but having eschewed nuclear, they're turning off nuclear reactors and burning brown coal in its place, which is a dreadful source. It's about 3 times worse than burning natural gas to produce your electricity. So those are the areas that ought to be being phased out first, because they're the sort of the low-hanging fruit in terms of improving the situation.
Who do you see having a bigger role in transition? Governments or big energy companies? Who has more influence in this field?
Or governments. I mean, some of the big energy companies do try harder than others, but you're aware, I'm sure, of the latest brouhaha over Exxon Mobil. They've they've known about it for getting on for 50 years and been very accurately informed. So I don't think you can trust them to do it. And Shell and BP have wanted to look a little greener for a long time. And BP have rebuilt themselves as beyond petroleum, but they're not going to do it on their own. No, governments have to do it. And no, I think Canada, the federal government in Canada, is to be commended for its carbon tax, which is still relatively modest, but it's ratcheting up steadily to $170 per ton by 2030. And that really will bite. You need carbon taxes of the order of $100 or so per ton to really force people to change. And that in Canada is coming, despite a lot of screaming and yelling from the provinces that are particularly rich in petroleum, particularly Alberta.
Would it help if all the governments that are currently active in hydrogen had better connections among themselves in terms of regulations, in terms of cooperation and general standards? Of course, on the production and transport and so on.
I think that's not actually a big issue. I mean, we can see this in the last few months, the extent that Germany is pushing Canada to export hydrogen for their purposes. Now, it's not ideal in the sense that at the moment, most countries are looking for energy security in the form of liquefied natural gas. Natural gas is somewhat better than oil, but not a whole lot better, both in terms of a little bit less CO2 emission, slightly higher energy content. I see that as being, at best, a very short-term bridge. It's probably necessary, but it really is not going to, as long as we're using that to a significant degree, it's not going to address the real issue, which is the getting ourselves to a point where there is zero emission. And we've got to get, I've always argued that anything that doesn't remove 80% of the CO2 emissions shouldn't be on the table. One would desire to have better than that, but that's the very minimum. And going with natural gas doesn't pass that test.
Thank you very much. I can see this conversation already as triology, but for the first time, I'm really happy with what I heard, and I really value your opinions. So thank you for your time, and hope to talk to you soon.
And I hope you can help influence the situation. It would be anything that you and I and anyone else can do to help the world see that this A is urgent, and B, that there are routes to solve it if we just get our act together to do it.
Thank you.
Okay. Say it again. You're most welcome. Pleasure talking with you.